Hey guys, welcome back. It's your girl Sade and welcome to Sade's Mix. Today we are going to be discussing one of South America's most prolific serial killers, Pedro Lopez. Pedro Lopez himself has claimed to have killed more than 350 young girls in Colombia, Peru, and Ecuador in the mid-70s. And guess what, guys? As of right now, his whereabouts are unknown. This story has so many plot twists. I hope you guys enjoy it. But before I get started, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, ring that bell so that you are notified when I upload any content. I think it's best for me to give a warning and that viewer discretion is advised. I'm going to be talking about rape, sodomy, child rape, and if any of that offends you, I totally understand. I very much appreciate you guys. But enough of my rambling, let's get right into it. Pedro Alfonso Lopez was born on October 8th of 1948 in a small city called TOLMIA, Colombia. It was said that Pedro was born at the cusp of the Civil War that would last for 10 years and claim well over 200,000 individuals. So it's safe to say that when he was born, it was definitely a chaotic time. It was said that Pedro was born to a penniless prostitute, and his father had been murdered when his mother, Belinda Lopez, was just 3 months pregnant with Pedro. Pedro was also the seventh child of 13 that Belinda did have, and his childhood would be described as anything but joyful. It was said that his mother was abusive and she would even perform her acts in front of her children. In an interview that Pedro would do in the early 1990s, he would describe the fact that he would have to sleep with all of his siblings in one bed, and there would be just a thin curtain in which he would see his mother perform her acts. It was also said that a lot of her clients also abused Pedro as well. So just imagine witnessing your mother have a man day in and day out. He really had no upbringing, and it was said that they also lived in deplorable conditions as well. But regardless of his home life, it was better than being outside in the streets. As I stated, there was a lot of chaos and a lot of violence, and it was not a place for kids to be. But sadly, in 1957, at the young age of 8, Pedro's mother would uncover him molesting one of his younger siblings, and she was livid. She believed that the best course of action was to exile her 8-year-old into the streets. So one day she took her son Pedro outside of the city limits and left him there. Luckily, he was able to find his way back home the first time, but she was not having him back in the house. So she decided to put young Pedro in a car and drive him 200 miles outside of the city and toss him into the street. And Pedro was confused, scared, not understanding. He knew what he did was wrong, but how could his mother just abandon him? And Pedro tried to make the best of best. And he was scavenging and trying to look for food, and he was begging on the streets just to try to see if someone would take him in. And then this elderly man would notice Pedro in the street, and he would lure Pedro in with promise of room and board and a good meal. And at 8, Pedro's like, my luck has changed. So Pedro went with this older man, and sadly, this older man was a pedophile. And he lured Pedro into an abandoned house where he would repeatedly sodomize young Pedro before tossing him back out on the streets. Now you can only imagine what young Pedro was going through. He was just abandoned by his mother, and within a couple of days he's picked up by a pedophile, and he is terrified of strangers. He decides that he is going to just sleep on the streets and just figure it out on his own. But he realized that he needed protection. So he joined a local gang to serve protection, and this is when Pedro really started committing just small crimes petty theft in order to just get by day. Pedro would stay within his city, so TOLMIA, and then he would later leave and go to BOGATO a year later. So he spent the whole year in this gang just trying to make ends meet. And then a year later, at the age of 9, he goes into another city. And luck would actually change for young Pedro. One day, while begging on one of the many street corners that they have, he was actually noticed by an elderly American couple, and their heart was just broken over the state that young Pedro's body was in. It was said that he was literally skin and bones, he was filthy, he was dirty, he looked significantly younger than what he was telling the American couple he was. And just like the pedophile, the American couple promised him room and board and that he would be safe. And at first, Pedro was traumatized. He was not ready to go with these people, but he was literally starving. So he decided to go with this American couple, and they actually did provide him with room and board, and they even enrolled him for school for the local orphans. So you would think, yeah, everything's going well. We wouldn't be here if that was the case. Sadly, about 3 years into his stay with this American family, he would once again be sexually assaulted, but this time by a male teacher at his orphanage. And when this happened, it just messed up Pedro even further. He was livid that he was reliving this situation all over again in a place that he thought he was going to be safe at. And he decided that he could not stay there any longer, and he needed to go back to Colombia, the streets of Colombia, because at least there he knew that he was safe and he knew he could survive there. So Pedro made the choice, but before leaving the orphanage, he robbed them and then decided to go back to Colombia. Now I'm not smiling because haha, but I'm like, you know what? He deserved it because he's been through some shit. But whatever, not the story. So it's said now, between the ages of 12 and 18, Pedro really picked up a craft of boosting cars and delivering them to local chop shops. And it was actually said that Pedro was actually really good at this and was making some really decent money. He even had the local boys as apprentices to help him to get new cars, so he was actually kind of looked upon in the community at the time. But as with all criminals, he got sloppy, and in 1969, at the age of 18, Pedro was arrested for auto theft, and he was sentenced to 7 years in the Colombian prison. I kid you not, 2 days into Pedro's prison sentence, he was gang raped by 4 other inmates, and Pedro just snapped. He stated that this was going to be the last time that he was going to be a victim. And he was seeking justice, not for just this abuse, but for the abuse that he had endured since he was 8. And Pedro decided that he was going to make a makeshift knife, and over the period of 2 weeks, he stalked and murdered all 4 men that had raped him. Now during this time, the Colombian authorities was just trying to make sense of like what was going on and why everyone was being murdered in this prison, and they deemed that this act was an act of self-defense, and they decided that yeah, he had to pay for this crime. Now, what I'm about to tell you is absolutely upsetting. So how much time do you think that he was given? 5 years, 10 years, 20 years? Pedro was given a grand total of 2 years added on to his 7-year sentence. Now, when I read this, I was like, just 2 years, not 2 years per person. And I was like, Colombia, you guys are wild. Like, wow. Like, he literally got away with murder. So, whatever, back to the story. Pedro, of course, serves his time, but with the previous abuse and the prison abuse, it really put Pedro in a darker place than he was even in before. And during this time, it was said that Pedro would state that, he hated his mother. And, having relations with a woman seemed impossible, and he would get his thrills off of pornography and books, but he would say that every misfortune, even the fact that he could not sexually perform, was due to his mother. And he, like I said, he hated his mother, and he believed that she was the root of it all. So Pedro would go out to serve the remaining of his sentence, and in 1979, Pedro was released from Colombia, and during this time period, he decided that he was going to leave Colombia and start traveling in Peru. And throughout this time period, this is when Pedro said that at the start of 1979, he would go on to stalk, rape, abduct, and murder at least 110 or more Peruvian girls from the local Indian tribe. Now I know what you guys are saying. How do we know? How do we know? Now it is hard to validate Pedro's claims because a lot of the bodies and girls have never been recovered, but there are several cases of when Pedro has almost been caught. There was one case in which he was actually caught in the process of abducting a 9-year-old girl from a local Indian tribe. I will put their name down below, in which the people decided to strip him, torture him for hours until they came to the conclusion that this man was a madman and that they needed to get rid of him. So that group decided, or that tribe decided, that they were going to bury Pedro alive. But luck would have it, as it always seems with these criminals, that an American missionary would actually intervene and talk down the Indian tribe and explain that killing Pedro was ungodly. And eventually, this Indian group decided that, you know what, they weren't going to kill him, that they were going to listen to the American missionary group and bring him to the Peruvian authorities so that he would serve for his crime. And okay, so in the process of exporting young Pedro to the Peruvian government, once received by the Peruvian government, they realized that this tribe, they didn't want to deal with the complaint. They didn't want to deal with the hassle of him trying to almost abduct a 9-year-old girl, and they decided that they were just going to release him. But they didn't release him back in Peru. What they did was that they deported him back to Ecuador. And during this time period, Pedro decided to start traveling in and out of Peru and Colombia. He was focusing, of course, on young girls between the ages of 8 and 12. And it was just a matter of time before authorities started noticing that there was a large amount of young girls going missing, and no one was able to account for it. Now, at some point, the authorities believed that it was a local either sex trafficking ring or just a sex ring. So they were like, whatever, this happens. But little did they know that all of these young girls were going missing because of Pedro. And they had him in their midst, and they just released them back into the wild. In the one interview that Pedro did do in the 90s, he was quoted to say this, I quote, "I walked among the markets searching for a girl with a certain look on her face, a certain look of innocence and beauty. She would be a good girl, always working with her mother. I followed them sometimes for 2 or 3 days, waiting for the moment when she was left alone. I would give her a pretty, shining trinket, then get her to leave with me for the edge of town where I would promise her another gift for her mother." So Pedro had an MO of how he was able to easily capture these young girls, and he would also find these girls in the poorest, deplorable nations that were out there. So he was able to just go in and out and be unnoticeable. Now, while the authorities were trying to figure out like what was happening to these young girls, in April of 1980, in a small village called AMBATO in Ecuador, there was a flash flood, and it unearthed the remains of 4 young girls. And it had appeared that these young girls were strangled, and they had been strangled with such force that a lot of their eyes were out of their socket. And the authorities had a hunch that at this point they had a serial killer, and this individual was making sure that these bodies were not covered, and he was placing them in areas that were so random. Pedro just kept on hunting, and it didn't faze him that they had found 4 bodies. And just a couple of days after the 4 young bodies were found, Pedro was once again apprehended. Doing what? Abducting a 12-year-old girl. But this time, the mother realized that her daughter was missing, and she screamed, and the local villagers realized that Pedro was literally walking out of the town with this young girl. They stopped, they apprehended him, and they called the local authority. Now, when the local authorities got there, they stated that Pedro was mumbling and saying things, and he was very erratic, and they weren't able to understand him. And by the time that they got Pedro to the police headquarters, they were able to see in Ecuador that they had a madman on their hands, and they were under the impression that they think that this man was involved. Now, once in the Ecuadorian police headquarters, Pedro went silent. He pled the fifth. He wasn't saying nothing. He wasn't talking, wasn't giving them anything. And the police quickly realized that asking him, interrogating him, it was going nowhere. So, one of the detectives had an ingenious idea. They decided to get a local pastor, dress him up in prison garb, and put him in Pedro's cell. Who better to get someone to talk about their sins than a pastor, you know? Now, the story is kind of fuzzy because one story says it was a local pastor who pretended to be a prisoner, and then it also says that it was a detective that pretended to be a prisoner. Somebody pretended to be a prisoner, and they gave a statement. And this statement stated this, I quote, "For 27 days I hardly slept, afraid I'd be strangled in my bed. I kept a towel wrapped around my throat, but I tricked Lopez into confessing by pretending I was a rapist too. He boasted to me of murder after murder in Ecuador, Colombia, and Peru. It was beyond my wildest nightmares. He told me everything." End quote. Pedro also told the pastor and or detective, quote, "I looked into her eyes and see a certain light, a spark suddenly go out. Only those who kill know what I mean." End quote. So he's actually talking about the fact of when he would get his victims, how he would rape and then strangle them. But he would rape them at night and wait until the sun came up and would strangle them as the sun was rising so that he can see the light leave from their eyes. When I read that, I was disgusted. It's so disgusting to hear him talk about the crimes he committed with no regard. He is the textbook definition of a sociopath. During his confession, Pedro would actually blame his rough upbringing and his lonely adolescence. He stated, I quote, "I lost my innocence at age 8. So I decided to do the same to as many young girls as I could." And at first, the police, once they were handed with his confession, they didn't believe Pedro. They thought that he was just a madman and that these were just hallucinations or dreams or just him being crazy. And when Pedro caught wind of the fact that the investigators didn't believe him, he decided to show them the real monster of the Andes. And Pedro even took them to one of his local grave sites in which they found 53 young bodies, ages 8 to 12. He also proceeded to take them to 23 other grave sites, but the police officers didn't find anything in these grave sites, and it was believed that the river and or local animals were to blame for the fact that they couldn't find any more bodies in this city. And now here's where it gets messy. So in 1980, I stated it's kind of hard to say when exactly in 1980, but in 1980, he was convicted for life imprisonment in Ecuador. So I know that there are a lot of you who are out there, so how come they don't know where he is? If he's sentenced for life in prison, did he escape? Did he not go to prison? Like, what happened? What I'm about to tell you is just wild, okay? So I had to look up certain laws to make sense as to how he really didn't serve much time. And in my research, I was able to uncover that Ecuador life sentence is only 25 years max. So it doesn't matter if you kill one or 101, you will only be able to serve 25 years. And in the articles that I was reading, it was said that these laws were put in place 100 plus years ago to protect the presidents and the residents of Ecuador and to be more humane. Because in Colombia, the death penalty is still there, and they do it by firing squad, at least from during Pedro's time. I'm not sure how they go about it now, but they have the death penalty there, unlike Peru and Ecuador, which I was like, holy crap. This man has murdered so many young girls, and he's only going to do 25 years, which means at the age of 34, he was eligible to be back in the streets. And it gets worse, guys. Not only did Pedro not serve the full 25 years, he only served 18 years in Ecuador due to good behavior. So they released him early, but once he was released in Ecuador, the plan was to extradite him back to Colombia, but that never happened. Then in 2002, it was reported that the FBI was looking into a crime that was very similar to Pedro's, but as of 2002, no one has been able to locate him or has collected the ransom on his head. And it is said that Pedro is still out there committing crimes. As of right now, Pedro would be 72 years old, and it just appeared that if he was to stop, he would continue killing. And that's what I have for you guys today. I hope you enjoyed the story of the monster of the Andes. I don't even know what to say because the story was so heavy. Let me know what you guys thoughts down below, of course. Comment. Let me know who you guys want me to do next time. I really much enjoyed any true crime story. But yeah, be safe out there. Wear your mask. And I will be seeing you guys next time. Bye.